I would like to turn to some comments that I have for today. In the spirit of Father's Day, I was thinking about what it is, and I think that all of us kind of encounter this from time to time when a younger person comes to us and says, asks one of those amazing questions like, what is the meaning of things and what am I here for? And what does my existence mean? And I was thinking about this in the last couple of days and thinking about this morning. And I think that if I had something to share with someone younger than me who was looking for whatever wisdom I've gained along the way, I would say, well, kid, what you need to do is you need to find your song. And what do I mean by that? And where does that come from? Well, in the animal wisdom teaching traditions that exist in many modalities and ideas of spirituality, there is the teaching of the whale. And part of the teaching of the whale is that among the species of whales who sing, what we know from scientists and experts is that while whales live in pods or families of some kind, and within the songs they sing, there is a dialect that they obviously understand, that each whale has its own song. In fact, scientists who work with them directly can begin to identify an individual that they've been in connection with or contact with or in view of for quite some time. Because sometimes that's what marine biologists do, is they will come in contact with whales and kind of keep track of them and stay in touch with them and see where their migrations take them, and they identify them. And so we've all heard about them tagging whales and things like that, but they can actually begin to identify whales by their songs before they can even see them, because these songs travel at great distances. And from what I understand, over time, once that song is found, it morphs and changes over time. And so when I am exposed to this teaching, and I think about it metaphorically, and I bring it into my own life, is that I say, Andy, what the meaning of your life is to find your song. And we can look at that as authenticity. We can look at it as our highest good. We can look at it as our evolutionary journey. And if I further explore that, I think about, well, what's that mean? What's that look like over time? And how does that show up? And do I think that it shows up in a particular way for everybody? In other words, is there a specific ritual I can go to, or a specific teaching that will say, well, this is exactly the formula of how you begin to put together your song? And when that question comes up, I'm reminded of something that had such a great impact on me when I first got involved in religious science. Now, my religious backgrounds before getting into New Thought and metaphysics and religious science, and I'm only speaking from the standpoint of Andy, I'm not putting a universal idea on this, but in my religious experiences earlier, I always felt like there was kind of a smallness about my existence. I always felt like I was an insignificance, and I struggled with self-esteem issues and things like that. So a lot of that was, it was mostly, Andy's deal, right? And so I had to look at that. So I came into religious science, and there's this little sentence that I found early on from one of my teachers that had such a powerful impact on me. And Ernest Holmes says, "Cast out a no longer useful littleness." Cast out a no longer useful littleness, which basically says to us that our potentiality is without horizon, basically. In other words, how we work with the universe ourselves, how we begin to formulate our song, our authenticity, is absolutely completely up to us in terms of of our authenticity and what makes us special. Years ago, I knew a man who, when I got to know him, he was in his middle to late 30s. And he was sharing with me kind of his story of his life, and starting with his middle teens up through his 20s and everything, he had taken his life off the rails in a lot of different ways. When I say off the rails, he was living in a very unhealthy way. He was living in a way where he was incredibly unhappy, and he was acting out in that way. And his parents had divorced when he was younger, and so he became very, very close to his mom. And his mom was always his cheerleader. She was always his champion, no matter what, whether it was juvenile hall or whether it was probation or whatever it was. She was there to touch him and to love him and to connect with him. And she always encouraged him to put down some of the things that were causing him issues and to pick up a life that would illuminate what he had to bring into the world. And in other words, I know there's something greater for you. And so when I knew him, he had been someone who was not only had changed his life incredibly, you wouldn't know that he'd ever had that experience, but he was also someone who wouldn't take no for an answer when it came to transformation and change and doing what he had to do. He got himself involved in programs and counseling, and there wasn't anything that he would let get by him. He was so hungry to try and be the best he could and to live a more fulfilled life. And so I asked him, I said, what happened? And he said, my mom was always my cheerleader, and right around the time I hit 30 or my early 30s, she suddenly passed away. She made her transition. And he said, something happened to me. It was like it grabbed my attention so completely that I felt like I had wasted my relationship with my mom, because she was always the one giving and I was always the one taking, and I wasn't going to be able to give to her, this person who I love more than anyone in the world. Now, that wasn't exactly the magic moment. At that time, he began to drift closer to his father, and his father had remarried for many years. And he found that in his stepmother was this wonderful person who once again stepped forward and did nothing but encourage him and love him in her own way. And suddenly he said, what really got his attention was, he said, I don't want to squander another opportunity to someone who really cares about me. I don't want to do to them what I did my mother. And so that was the turning point for him. That was the switch that turned him. And then he went on and said, I hate to think of it that way. I hate to think that something good came out of my mom's passing. And I remember I could imagine what he was saying, that we have this kind of mixed bag that that we feel like something's been squandered, and we see something that we may call a tragedy, and we may be expected to see it as a tragedy, but then to suddenly say, but it's because of this that I somehow found something. And again, I go back to Ernest Holmes, cast out a no longer useful littleness. And basically what Holmes is saying there is that no matter what we see, if it becomes the building block of what brings us joy, what brings us meaning, what brings us healing, should be seen and celebrated to the degree that it has an impact on our lives. And of course, if we flesh out the spiritual philosophy and teaching, it says that we're all eternal beings. And so we know, as a metaphysician, I know in my heart that this gentleman's mother moved on with her life with a capital L for her, moved on, and that she exists and that she moves forward. And so it's interesting, when I got to know him, we had this conversation and I shared this piece with him that had been so meaningful to me. Because like all of you, I guess I see it as part of the human experience is that we do go through shadow. We do go through our ups and downs. We sometimes don't show up the way we want to. We're not as graceful as we want to be. And yet, there are opportunities that come up regardless of how they show up that can be incredibly illuminating. As a lot of you know, I lived in Paradise for a long time, and I was part of the fire that took place there a couple of years ago. And when the fire happened, I went into kind of the mode of to find a place for us to live and to move forward, and how do we move forward, and of course the business of all that, the business of that, and the emotions of that, and the material challenges of that to start over. And there were all these kinds of places along the way. So I kind of went into the mode to where I became a human doing. And I was just like, whatever was in front of me, that's where I went, and 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 I did the business of it and all kinds of things. And after Judy and I had gotten settled in Chico, well, shortly before then, shortly before we were able to manifest a place here in Chico, and begin to put a material home back together. I remember I was heading up to Reading one Saturday. I was taking a year-long class at that time too. And I got Judy called me and said, hey, they've opened up Paradise today for us to go up there. For people who had property up there or lived up there could go up there. And so I called my teacher in Reading. I said, I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm going to shoot up to Paradise. And I wasn't kind of expecting that. And so I turned around on I-5, came down, went up to Paradise. And I don't think I was emotionally prepared for what I went through. And so coming into the town, and Judy and I lived in the very upper end of Paradise. And so going up Skyway, and I felt, so I'm going through, and I wasn't prepared for it in terms of the trees and the buildings and things that weren't there, and the carnage. I mean, it looked to me like what maybe a war zone might look like, and especially with what was left of buildings and burned out cars and things like that. And I found this sadness washing over me. So I finally got all the way up to the upper end of town. It's moving very slow because a lot of people were up there. It was kind of this slow procession, and people would turning off different roads and streets. And I finally got up there, and I couldn't go all the way into where we lived because it had been roped off because the road had been so damaged. So I parked my car and I walked in. I walked into a neighborhood that at one time was so vibrant and filled with cars and people and, and activity, and, like you have in a neighborhood. And it was very quiet, and it was, of course, the remnants of what happened. And I finally found where our home was, and I walked in, and I remember standing in the middle of that burned out space. And suddenly I felt a deep ache in my life that I named home. And I wanted this to be my home. And I felt at that moment really knocked off my center, more so than almost any time during that whole event in terms of my life. I was an atheist standing there. I was lost. I was meaning just kind of drained out of me. And I just stood there, and there was an ache in my heart, and I was very emotional. And it started something in me that kind of hung with me for a long time even after that day. Because what was I supposed to do? Was I supposed to sit in the middle of that rubble and just say, well, this is my home, and this is just where I'm going to live? I had no option. The limb behind me had been cut off, and there was a deep sense of emptiness inside me. And I kind of put home over that, or belonging, or center, center as in my center. Then I left there and I drove, I found a few things that I could salvage on our little piece of land and threw them in the back of my car and stuff. And then I drove to where the center was up there, Center for Spiritual Living Paradise. And I went there and it was the same thing. And I walked around it. And I remember the chairs that were in the sanctuary they were the metal frames, the burnt out metal frames were all there. And as someone who stood in front of that room, I remembered where people sat from Sunday to Sunday, because people tend to sit in the same place. And they were all facing forward into something that wasn't there. And again, it kind of intensified this place of all I could do was label it home and center, my center. And I couldn't get a hold of it. There was like an empty place inside me that occupied. So quite a bit of time went by, and Judy and I were putting our lives back together, and we made our final move to Chico. And once again, it was kind of become a human doing. But I had this inside me, and I couldn't shake it. I did a lot of work around that. And then one day I went into a secondhand kind of antique store here in Chico, one of the great ones. Actually, it's the one, if you're familiar with it, way out there by the railroad tracks. It's an old railroad warehouse out there. And I don't know what the name of it is, but I love going out there. And so I was supposed to go out there and pick up maybe a couple tables, small tables, and maybe a chair and things like that. And I was going to shoot some pictures on my phone and send them to Judy, and she was somewhere else at the time, to say, what do you think, and stuff like that. And so I had just kind of gone out there on my own, and I'm looking around, and there's all these shelves that are up with all, these places, they're great. There's knickknacks and all this stuff up there. So I look up and I see this gentleman right here, and I hope you can see him. I don't know. Bear with me. I'm trying to see if you can see him. I don't know. Well, here he is. Okay. And he was looking out at me, and I don't think you can probably see him really well because he's in dark wood. I don't know what the artist had in mind for him. I'm not sure what he's supposed to be. He's very ethnic, but to me, he looks Taoist. And I love the Tao. And the Tao has been an important part of my life. And there's a tradition within the Tao that you think of the wanderer, the old sage, the wise one, the wanderer who has the walking stick like this right here. And he's obviously very Asian. He's got the hat that protects from the sun. He's got a long beard, and he's leaning on his walking stick, and he's dressed, and you probably can't see it, but he's got a wonderful smile. He's got a toothy smile. He's got some teeth hanging out there. And I'm walking through that store, and he peers out from a shelf, kind of a dark corner out at me, and I'm drawn to him. And I looked him over, and I continued on because I was there for some tables and chairs. And I kept coming back. And I looked at him, and so I projected my meaning on him as the Taoist wanderer. And when I began to do that, this place within me began to soften. And I thought, that's really interesting. What's going on here? And it was like what he was saying to me. He was speaking to my song, and he said, Andy, home is in the journey. Home is in the journey. And I would love to walk that journey with you. So I left him one more time because I'm supposed to get my tables and chairs, but I kept coming back. And I didn't pay very much for him at all, but I knew I had to have him. As a reminder, because a healing began to take place, and and Andy began to find his song again. I have an altar at home that has kind of 3 levels to it, and he sits on the very top. And every morning when I get up and I get ready for my day and all of that, when I'm heading out the door, I spend just a moment before him. I love my home with Judy. I love our physical home. We have begun to make a new home and we've begun to feel good there. But what I found is that my song is when I can open up to the fact that I am on a spiritual journey. That's what defines me. And that's what Ernest Holmes meant years ago when he said, Andy, cast out a no longer useful littleness. I've been intrigued by the idea. I'm speaking today of faith, believe it or not, and I've always been intrigued. The title of today is faith as a verb, and I've always been intrigued by the idea that in metaphysics, faith is very much intertwined with intention. Intention is very much of an active word, and I see faith in the same way. I think that we have to work at developing our song and at the same time release into a trusting that the universe shows up in that way. That there is a loved one who can tell us the truth. There is a secondhand store icon that can remind us of something. Or there is a fire. There is a fire that becomes part of the synchronicity of how we find a greater expansion of our truth. I was in the presence of some religious science people yesterday, and we were having a conversation. And one of the people in that conversation, another minister, was sharing that we were talking about the fact that we were in this pandemic and we were kind of all at home and we were all going low and slow and everything. And our lives had kind of slowed down and our lives had kind of quieted down. And then this issue with George Floyd happened and got all of our attention and literally went global in terms of its impact. And we were talking about where we all stand, not only as a country, but as a world in terms of, is there a way that we need to show up differently? Is there a depth to our collective song that needs to intensify to where we can begin to live under the grandest of ideals that we all claim to live by as a result? And we have the Black Lives Movement and we have the demonstrations. And what this minister said was, she was blown away by some synchronicities, and I want to share those with you. First, the synchronicity that why did this piece of video get our attention? And she said, because we were all quiet enough to truly see it, not to look at it in a clip, not to go by it, but to see it, to be present for it, and to allow it to wash over us. And then there's another piece of synchronicity that goes back much further, back in the days when all those nerdy guys were working in their garages on technologies, right? Computers and all that stuff, all these technologies. We would not have had that video to look at when we were in a quiet place, had someone not worked to develop these technologies to where someone was able to shoot a video of that and bring it into our presence, to allow us into stepping into a larger expression, a larger song, a larger authenticity. I was blown away. That minister was Reverend Sue Miller-Born in Chico, in Reading. And I spent a little bit of time with her the other day. And I was completely blown away with what she said. To have a 17-year-old girl hold up her phone in that moment and shoot that video to illumine the entire world. That's the macro. That is spirit. That is spirit showing up into our larger intention, because the real beautiful part of that is, metaphysicians, we believe that we have been collectively prepared and looking and yearning and hungering to see that image, because we so desperately want to change. We want to change this about us. Spirit, I love you. Yes, my beloved, it is done unto you. Here's the opportunity. Here's the song. Whether it's a woman who so desperately loves her son, whether it's an icon that stares out at a wounded individual who's looking for healing in a secondhand store, or whether it's a video that captures the entire world with an idea of change. That is breathtaking. That is where faith and intention come together to bring us into this amazing place. So I want to thank you so much on this Father's Day to spend a little bit of time with me. Namaste. And so now